All right. So today we'll be going through the solutions for homework 5, and I'll also be going through a few other examples that, like a few of the more advanced examples that are in the GitHub repo. So we'll, in particular, be talking more about looking at JavaScript events. Really the meat of what you would need to get um, to get some sort of interactivity in JavaScript, and talking a bit more about more advanced topics using both JavaScript and even throwing in some Flask examples. Before I get started, however, are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So when you say that the rest of our work is on the final project, you also mentioned an assignment six. Is assignment six turned in, or is it just that, we use the remaining time to work on our final project?
So assignment 6 is going to be turned in. I and I was just about to show it off in the GitHub page, in the Blackboard page, but I realized the later modules need some more updating. I believe, yeah, module 5 is all there, but I think module 6 needs to be updated there. So I'll make sure to update that. But module 6 is nothing in the GitHub repo for it because it's purely based on what feedback you got from me on the final project proposal.
Oh,
So
I see.
yeah,
Okay, so
so
it's an assignment that we have to work on and turn in, but it's going to relate to the final project that we're doing.
exactly, yeah, and I mean, usually with assignment 6, it is truly meant to be a rough draft, so I kind of bake the grade into the final project, but I'll obviously be more lenient if there's any issues with getting it in, because it's sort of the normal 2 week time there. But luckily, it's related to your final project, so any work you put in for module 6 will be in service of your final project there. Really, this was just meant to, first of all, get everyone started on that final project, and to try to encourage try to encourage some practice with the tools that we're learning towards the end of the semester.
Hey, Charles, this is Ritesh here. Can you repeat, like, do we need to submit anything for module 6 or we'll be just working on the project?
You do need
I'm
to,
not.
yeah, you do need to submit something for module 6, and it's not updated in Blackboard yet, but I will update that. I thought that was updated, but I'll update that right after this meetup.
So what we need to submit? I mean, can you repeat one? What we need to submit?
It's just,
Whatever portion we have completed for the project?
yeah. So did you see my feedback on your proposal?
Yeah.
Okay, so pretty much just I'll put this in the description of module 6, but really it's meant to be a static visualization in sort of a static visualization that is in service of your final project. So for a lot of the proposals, there were I would mention, for example, if the data seemed solid, but perhaps the use case needed some work. What I would say for assignment 6, and I would put this in the product. I would put this in my comments to each of you individually in the final project proposal, would be to think about what a use case would be. Think about, like, for this data set, it's a nice data set, so you don't need to really think about what sort of the data munging there, but think about more about what what you want the user experience to be. Do you want it to be, for example, more of an kind of exploratory use case? If it is exploratory, think about what sort of end user you have in mind. Is it a researcher? Is it a more casual user, for example? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right.
I mean, it's kind of EDA we'll be doing for module 6.
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Uh, could I ask just a request? Actually, unfortunately, I missed last week's or meetup 2 weeks ago. Is it possible to post the recording?
Yep, I uploaded those to YouTube. I just need to update the links, and I'll at least get um, the previous week's recordings updated tonight, and it takes a while to go to sort of GoToMeeting does this weird thing where it converts the videos, so I'll try to get that up later tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. And then Silverio's question about homework 5. Is anyone else in the second section experiencing an inactive link for homework 5? I mean, yeah, Silverio, you might, because and now that reminds me to share my screen. I'm seeing so if you, like I'm just going over to content and then module 5, and it should be right here. Cool, no worries. Oh no, that's just your standard assignment 5 there. Cool. Any other questions on the rest of the course? Cool. So,
Uh, I'm sorry, could I ask one question? Are we going to continue having the weekly discussion topics?
so actually, this week's is going to be the last discussion topic. I
Okay.
somehow always end up with like either too many or too few, depending on the cadence, but and sort of where I decide to honor holidays. But basically, this was the last discussion forum. So
Okay. All right. That's great. Thank
yep,
you.
we'll be done with that, and then so then the rest of it will truly be just working on that final. All right. Cool. And then just one more note on Module 6. With everyone's with everyone's submissions, I know that the majority of you are using either Dash or Shiny. I I originally had assignment 6 focus more on trying to like create a visualization out of either D3 or another charting library, but the first couple of times I tried that, it's not really conducive to really being sort of in service of your final. So the requirement is just use whatever tool you're using for your final. So if you're using Shiny, use R Markdown to kind of perform your EDA. But just kind of throwing it out there that if you do want to test things, that use this as an excuse to test things out with JavaScript, see what you are able to get done. I didn't really see it in the proposals, but if anyone's still unclear as to which tools they want to use, definitely use this as that sort of experimentation time. But obviously, what's more paramount is using, sort of completing that final project and making sure that it's, in the framework that you're choosing. So, that'll overall be a better experience if you're, using Shiny and you just use R to plot that out. So, just one thing to keep in mind there. So, but I'll post the link to that right after this meetup. And so let's get started here. So I'll first go through what I came up with for homework 5, And I thought I updated. I thought I updated this last week, but for some reason I'm still seeing the old version with part 3 here. So for those of you who um, would have been confused by that, that was sort of the previous iteration where I was focusing more on Flask. So part 3 shouldn't be there. It should just be parts 1 and 2. So I'll focus on those. I do have a Flask app that I want to show off as an example, but it's mainly in service of going through alternative JavaScript libraries. So with that, we'll start out with part 1. So the first question here, we're just looking to reverse anywhere. So first of all, just these functions in general, these should be very similar to what we were going through with the last week in our meetup, and what's in the GitHub repo. So this JS in a web page, .html, the level at which these, at least part 1 is pretty much what we were doing previously there. So there were 2 questions for part 1. The first, we're just looking to reverse any word that's typed in. So for something like this, if I type in a word, we're getting our reversed word just printed below. And the method that we're using for that is pretty similar to what we were using in that first sort of in those past examples. So really we have a standard HTML form that we're using. In this case, we're just using this text input and having this this button submit that. This button is where we're tying the logic of what we want the interactivity to be. So the button is essentially being used to call some function, some JavaScript function that we're defining below, something that we're defining over here. And then just in terms of what I'm doing with the string, it's just some pretty basic uh, string manipulation. So we have this doc submit button. This is tied to doc submit. Here we're calling another function, this write to DOM, writing an element to the to a specific tag and giving it the content that we want, and then that's being fed by this this reverse string function here. And one thing just to note about how I'm accessing the value there. So here, and this should be making everyone familiar. Should be ringing some bells for Dash, where really we're accessing, we're sort of accessing the value. So this is very similar to what we put in our callback decorators when we're looking at a particular value. And in particular, we're looking at this text input. So you could see this reverse text input, reverse text input, and then document is the just full a full document that we're looking at here. So what this reverse string function is doing is basically saying whenever, so first of all, it's within doc submit, so it's being called whenever the submit button is pressed. And all this is doing is whenever that button is pressed, it's reading the value from that form here. And and so yeah, that's really what's happening there. And then the actual string reversal is happening just in a for loop here. So we're we're sort of starting out with this output, and we're just appending the letter before that output. And it's I'm sort of going through like where in particular it's getting this value, trying to relate that to Dash, because you know this isn't similar to even Dash itself is low level compared to something like Shiny, but JavaScript, as you'll see when we're looking at when we're using D3 to read in the precedence table, it's extremely low level. So it's so really um, as I mentioned in previous weeks, you don't have things like data frames. You're using primitive structures like JSON objects and arrays. Just trying to match things like that. So you'll notice a lot of these, what'll seem like hacky solutions when compared to something something like R and Python, but it's sort of the nature of the beast with JavaScript. So that's what's happening there. Any questions on that first one so far? Cool. So for question 2, we're doing some editing here. So for question 2, we're just going to print out a multiplication table for any input number. So similarly, we're using our standard HTML form. One thing to note, we have this type as number rather than up here where we have the type as text. And the way that you see that is you notice you're able to just enter in a number like any other form input, but what the numeric input gives you is this ability to kind of jog up and down. It's just something to keep in mind there. And then this is a bit more complicated. Here, we were just taking a string and we're just we're just printing out that string. So if I go into my DevTools here, you'll see exactly what that looks like. So in our code, we have this blank div referring to the first, the ID being first, referring to the first question. And all that's doing is it's populating the text directly into that div. So, totally unformatted, not much is going on there. When we're looking at this, there's some more complex layouts going on. So, we're creating a multiplication table, and as a result of that, we're using an HTML table in order to do that. So how are we doing that? We are doing that, first of all, just to sort of tie this to what's happening. So we're using this write table. And this write table is utilizing some of the functions above it. But and I don't want to delve too much into here. I'll let people, sort of read through this at their own leisure. But really, we're sort of building this as a string, and we're looping through. We're using this for loop, but we're, sort of using logic based on the number of columns to decide how we want to build this table. So, we have our table. We're using, like, if we have even multiples, so if we have no divisor, then we're just adding our open tr. We're adding our cells, so the actual element as well as the cell. And then similarly, we're testing if we're at the last item in the column and adding this close tr. And then finally closing out the table. And what that looks like in here is this. And the cool thing about this is as you're hovering over it, you're able to see what element it's referring to. So this row, you could see sort of our different rows, and then look at the individual columns as well, individual cells rather. And you'll also notice that this is still, this is as advertised, pretty low level. We're using, we're kind of using these more just simple for loops and text to arrive at the HTML that we're inserting in, and using this base level JavaScript. If you were a web developer, there are tons of libraries out there that that make JavaScript more elegant than this, but I think it's useful to really look at this level, because this ties in. This is really how the best way to kind of look at something like D3 or a lot of other JavaScript data visualization packages out there. So any things like Plotly.js, Vega, or even something like Mapbox, Leaflet. It's really best to kind of build those off of just vanilla JavaScript rather than getting more into detail with other JavaScript frameworks out there. And then pretty much what we're doing, this make multiples, is just creating an array. So that's the raw values that are being put in given the seed, and then this table make function is what's taking the array, taking the number of columns, and which I'm defining right here, and just creating the table there. So that was part one. And then we'll move on to part two, where we're utilizing D3. Any questions on that before I move on? Cool. So for this third question, we're actually going to be using D3. We're not visualizing this, but really this is the core of what D3 is doing, taking data and binding it to elements in our page. So in this case, we're just simply making a table, but really this is the crucial building block to eventually building more complex visualizations using D3. And then the pattern that we'll look at with D3, like this is a pretty good approximation as to how you would be building more complex types of D3 visualization. So if you look at examples out there and are sort of just checking out what is possible with something like D3, you'll notice these patterns are pretty well established out there. So there's a few things that I'm doing here. So first of all, you'll notice that everything is within this d3.csv function. I mentioned this last week, where d3.csv, it's bringing in data in what's called an asynchronous method. So really this is meant to just play more nicely with more advanced JavaScript environments. But from our perspective, don't worry too much about what's actually going on. Just kind of try to sort of think of this as the pattern that's being used. So you have this sort of address, like some sort of where the source data is coming from, and then you have an anonymous function. So we're inserting this directly into this d3.csv function, And this is in Python, it's lambda. That would be sort of an anonymous function there. And I believe you could operate similarly with R, although I never really seen that pattern in action there. But in JavaScript, you'll actually be noticing this a lot. So I'll this kind of pattern where you're inserting anonymous functions like this. So I'll try to go through this step by step. So first, what we're doing is let's just take a look at what the structure of our table is. So we just have sort of names, heights, weights, and I'm defining those columns separately up here. So depending on the shape of the data, I could I could kind of change the columns that I'm looking at. Here they're hard coded, but you could imagine that if I wanted to make something more general, that's reading in any any size CSV and we'll just simply display it on the page. I could have I could have inferred that from the from the CSV itself and end up with sort of something that's not hard coded. But here I'm just hard coding the columns for clarity's sake. And last week when I was going through the very intro D3 examples, a lot of this pattern should be pretty apparent. But one thing that I'm kind of doing when when things get more complex is you'll see that I'm adding a bit more. You'll see more appends than in the more simple examples. The simple examples we were just simply selecting all and then sort of using this select and then enter kind of framework. But you could see what we're doing is first we're creating our header, or actually, I'm sorry, first we're creating a table. So we're selecting our element. D3, when you're selecting by ID, you have to use, and this is a common CSS selector syntax where you're putting a hashtag for the ID and a dot for class names if you wanted to do something like that. But we're selecting our div. Going back up here, we're selecting this right here. We're appending our table. And I'll go back here so that we could get more of an idea of what we're doing. So there you could see our table being appended. We're starting out with the header. So we're adding this t head, and we'll delve in here to look at what we're doing. So you can see we have two elements here. We have this t head and t body. So there's my t head getting added here. T body is coming up. Notice that both of them are building off of table. So whenever you have appends after each other, that's kind of referring to a nested structure like this. Whereas if I reference that variable twice like this, I'm getting this pattern where it's sort of one after another. That's something just to keep in mind in terms of the pattern here. And then things begin getting more familiar for, or not more familiar, more similar to the simpler examples. So, this select all is really what we're binding the data to. So we're selecting all of these header cells. We're looking at, and then we're binding this to our column. So, we have this simple array that we're binding that to. And that's what's creating this right here. So we appended our tr and we're adding all ths, name, height, weight. And then in the body, we have a similar pattern going on. So we're selecting our t body, adding another row, and then for each of these, I'm sorry, we're adding our rows here. So yeah, sorry, we're doing this in 2 steps. So here we're adding our TRs, and then for each cell, we're building off of those rows, and we're adding our different cells. So let's look at what's happening in this function here. So we're doing this select all TD. That means in all of our rows. So basically, we have a table. We would have multiple empty rows as of this step, and we're going to select all TDs within within sort of those rows. And this is very similar to the function, the callback functions that we were talking about last meetup, where if you don't put anything in the data, so far we haven't, well, actually, yeah, this is the simplest example. So this is more similar to what we were doing in previous weeks, where in order to get some sort of text, the text that is corresponding to the data, you need to return, you need to sort of enter this anonymous function, versus if I were to just put hello there or put something hard coded, it would just repeat that for each of the elements. But if you remember from our intro last week, even if you do that, the data is still binded to each of those elements. What this is doing is just allowing us to expose it and to do something with it. So here we're doing a more complex version of that. We're using this map function, which is this is similar to list comprehension, but basic in Python, where you're sort of performing a function across each element of the array and just sort of getting that result as an array. And we're returning this dictionary here, and this JSON object, and we're accessing that value here. So we're defining our value as sort of what column we're in, looking at the row, and then we're just simply putting that value into the corresponding cell. And then once we do that, just looking inside each of these, we end up with what you would expect. So we have this TR, and then we have these TD, the cells within the larger row. So are there any questions on how exactly this is working? So this is a good example of a really how much more sophisticated D3 could be, and we haven't even gotten up to visualizing with it yet. But any questions on what we have here so far? Cool.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
So maybe this is just me, and I'm not very familiar with JavaScript, but with these var statements, these look to me like it's declaring a new variable.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like not only are you declaring a new variable, it's actually taking actions which show up on the page. And I guess I was kind of not used to seeing, in one statement declaring a variable, performing actions on it. But then what seemed to be happening under the hood was that when you have all these actions, it somehow appears on the page. And that part of it was a little bit unclear to me how that's happening.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't have enough knowledge about really what's going on in the guts of JavaScript to, kind of give you a proper answer there. A lot of this I just kind of chalk up to, JavaScript. This is really making JavaScript do something that it wasn't really, designed to do. It's designed to be a very lightweight language to, work as sort of the language that's being used within the browser. You are right in kind of, and I want to make sure I'm not really giving any wrong information here. Like you are kind of right in that characterization that you could, really think of this chaining as you're performing a set of actions, and really what we're doing by defining these variables is almost dividing things up so that so that the code is more readable. Um, Beyond that, I don't want to dig myself further into a hole in terms of what exactly is going on, like by defining these variables. But it's but yeah, I mean, the way that you're thinking of it, that's I guess short answer, it is weird for those of us coming from a data science background.
Mhm.
Forgetting from the discussion boards, I know some people had um, have some experience with web development. I don't know if anyone on this call who does, but it's definitely a totally different world from what we're working with in sort of the pandas ecosystem and R. But good question though. Cool. So with that, move on to one of our um, I'll move on to this example here, which is using Plotly, and let me get this started. Um, where are we? Cool. So actually, I don't want to go into this hello Plotly and Flask. I'll just go into this one here. And I'm just going to be lazy and open it up. Whoop, never mind. I prepared that one, so let's just use this one. So I'm not going to talk too much about what's happening with Flask. I had, yeah, I won't touch too much on that, but I'll focus mainly on, so all Flask is doing for the sake of this example is it's allowing me to read in the data. It's essential. So we'll really just look at that a as what that's doing here. And so so here, this is the index that's showing up. You'll notice it's very bare bones. So I'm not even so the example I gave last time, like this is even more contextual based on the, contextually based on the data. I'm actually letting the data inform what the what the drop downs are going to look like. So I have this blank selector for metro area. I have this blank selector for seasonality. This is the same example, by the way, that I was using for Shiny, the just housing price data, and the but you'll notice that in the metro and seasonality, it's this is filled out here. So let's look in here to get an idea of what's happening. So first of all, I just wanted to look over here to show that the options are populated here. And that's happening in the first few lines of the code here. So this is similar to what I was doing before. Here it's a bit, I'm using Plotly's built-in implementation of D3 because I'm using Plotly just to create the visualizations. But this is just simply selecting by ID, doing the same, and this is doing that same pattern. And what I'm reading over here, this is what's coming in via Flask. So I don't want to get too much into it, but I'll just sort of mention what's happening here, that I'm essentially, let me go back here. So here we're going to HPI/values. That's referring to an address that's being defined here. So that's this HPI/values, and all I'm doing is reading in the CSV. So if I actually go to that, you'll see that I get something that looks like this. So the only reason I really wanted to even delve that much into it is because rather than using d3.csv, I'm using this d3.json in order to read that in. But don't focus too much on how I'm reading it in. It is still being done asynchronously, so you could see how it's all within this one wrapper function. And so what we're doing here, we're just populating our two selectors. So we're sort of looking at our default metros, and let me go back to what this is showing off, because I do want to kind of talk about one more thing that Flask is really achieving for me here. So, I mentioned before, JavaScript is a very low-level language. If you are using something like Plotly.js or D3.js for your final project, which I don't think anyone here is, but if you choose to use something like that, the really trick to doing it is to make sure that your data is formatted pretty much exactly the way that you need it before it's being used. And I'm using Flask in this way as a trick to achieve that. So going back to this here, Pandas has this very handy unique function. I'm essentially piggybacking off of Python to provide that to me. If you were using this for your project and didn't want to implement Flask, you could just simply create a JSON file based on like just create sort of your files exactly how you need them to be. so that you're doing minimal data wrangling in JavaScript. This is one pattern in terms of using using something like D3, and especially with D3 as you get into the more advanced visualization types. So things like I'll bring up an example here. That's not what I wanted. I wanted a, where'd it go? There we are. So something like this, where you're looking at, you're trying to define regions that are sort of closer to certain points. The, when you're working with more complex visualizations like this, D3 sort of also does a lot of this for you. So you could think of D3 as like kind of feeding you something that's similar to this. So that's a digression in terms of D3, but let's continue on with what's happening with this with this index.js here, and yeah, so the so we have our selectors being used here. We're plotting our initial graph. So I'm using Plotly in this case. So the graph that we're creating is actually being fed by Flask. So if I go to and you can see sort of how I'm building the address here. So slash seasonality slash metro. So if I did something like this, getting an HPI. So this is, this is formatting my my data even more, where I'm just simply creating the graph JSON using Flask. So this is just a way of saying that no matter how you need your data, even if you want to just simply create the graph entirely within Python using using Plotly, you would be able to do something like that using a framework like Flask. So this is just sort of really meant to show off how we're sort of offloading work from the client side onto the server side, or in some cases where you're preparing files, that's not technically the server side, but it's functioning like the server side in that way. And but before, and I'm sort of running out of time here. I don't want to keep you guys too late, but the real thing I wanted to get through is looking at JavaScript events. So what we're doing here is we're using D3. So we have this plotly.d3, but consider that just d3.select. And we're selecting the actual element by ID. And we're using this on function. And this on function is how really you would get any sort of interaction with D3. So as an example, if you wanted to highlight, if you want to hover over a data point and display a tooltip based on that, you would use this .on syntax in order to do that. And the also just one thing to note, I'm using let here. Let is the same as var. This is just a bit more modern. The syntax of JavaScript has been changing, so so let is sort of the recommended way of defining a variable that is meant to change versus constant, which isn't going to change. But let's look at what we're, so just saying that, but let's look at what we're doing here. So, so basically with this on function, I'm just passing it an anonymous function. And all I'm doing is, in this case, I'm using plotly.react to interact with the graph div, again, within the d3.json. But I want you to look at this and compare this to compare this to what we're doing in these HTML forms. In particular, this on click button here. So really the way to sort of link what we're doing with this dot on is to kind of think of it as, it's also something that's coming from more primitive HTML forms. And all we're doing here is, simply replotting the graph based on what's being created via the API. I didn't want to focus too much on the actual creation of the graph, just really the pattern of when you are using this, when you want to add this interactivity, this is the way to go about that. Cool. So any other questions? Questions about what we've gone through or about the rest of the course? Cool. So one thing to note, I'll be the not next meetup, but the meetup afterwards, the meetup in mid-December. That's going to be the final. That's going to be the final meetup, and that's going to be when we're all when we're presenting our final projects. So I'll I'll probably combine the two meetups, and I'll post a sign up sheet in advance of that. So feel free to pick, in whichever section you want to go, and I'll try to stick to that. And but based off of the proposals, I'm really excited to see what everyone comes up with. We have a lot of great ideas out there, so really interested to see what everyone comes up with. Cool. All right, so good luck with the final projects. Be spending the next month working on those, and email me if there are any questions. But otherwise, good luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing those final projects.
All right, thank you.
Thanks a lot.